Hello, and welcome to the Specialty Matcha Podcast. My name is Ryan. This is my co-host Zongjun, who also goes by Sam.
Hello, hello.
And we're the co-founders of Senko Matcha Products.
Yeah, we launched this podcast to discuss our learning journey in matcha, share startup stories, and interview experts. In the past week or so, we are in this wonderful city of Kyoto again and visiting farmers in Uji. And we got actually invited specifically to visit this award-winning tea farmer, Tsuji-san, in Uji, who is one of the very few farmers who have received Emperor Award, but the only living farmer.
Ah,
Uh,
and he's frequently cited as the most awarded matcha farmer producer in Japan,
well,
and hence the world.
very, very cool experience.
A person we've heard about for years. I first heard about him through Johnny Matcha, and then indirectly through Kettle and Kettle's website and book. And then Mark from Oika and tons of other actually specialty matcha vendors have developed a relationship with Tsuji-san. And we've heard this name and heard about his agricultural practices. He was one of the few people that we decided we were not going to reach out to because one, he's infamously difficult to get a hold of because so many people come in for inquiries because he's gotten so famous. And so we decided to kind of play it cool, wait and see. We were like, the most likely way that we'll get in is someone at some point will hopefully give us an introduction. And that's what happened. We got
Yep.
very lucky.
Very lucky.
We're very grateful to our friends that we've met in Thailand.
Yeah, big appreciation. Thank you. Arigato gozaimasu to Kunpap and Yosuke-san, who are the owners of Kodo Tea Space in Bangkok, who invited us to join this wonderful journey
Yeah.
with Tsuji-san.
And they put together an educational trip. So there were a lot of people there, probably a group of 7 of us or maybe 8 of us. And they help with interpretation. And we were just able to ask a lot of questions. It was really unique about this experience is that both Kunpap and Yusuke-san are really good at getting very nerdy very fast with people.
Mm.
And there's this pretty interesting dynamic that happens in Japanese tea, but it also happens in Chinese tea and Korean tea circles whenever you're trying to go deeper and deeper about a subject is, a lot of tea people, farmers, producers, quote unquote tea masters who are masters at brewing or different types of ceremony, try to adjust everything to where you're at. Right. So sometimes it's kind of almost an unfriendly interaction where you're kind of gauging, okay, how much do you know? How much do I know? And then seeing where you fit. And then you kind of adjust your conversation that way. You can imagine that like being at a very fancy wine restaurant and they ask you like, what do you like to drink? And they kind of gauge your level of knowledge or experience off of this. So a lot of this is going on both explicitly and implicitly. And in a lot of the better interactions, like it's very, very implicit. It's very, very subtle. And we were actually talking about that with them afterwards. It's like unlocking a level.
Yeah.
And with someone like Tsuji-san, who is so familiar with the agriculture and is considered really one of the top masters in the entire tea masters in the entire world, not only for matcha, but just in tea more broadly. He only makes matcha or tencha. You kind of have to unlock those levels, right? If you go in asking like, what do you think about the matcha boom? That is an inherently less interesting question than talking about soil types and quantities, the implications of different types of fertilizer, really special nuances of traditional ways of processing. So we got to go very deep, very fast. And to be honest, we've recorded, I think it's about 80 episodes on the Specialty Matcha Podcast. And we've interviewed a lot of people and we've been doing a lot of learning over the years as we've done this podcast. And I'd say in the past 3 or 4 months, we've been in kind of a learning journey plateau. And we were actually getting a little bit bored. We kept rehearing the same information over and over. Everyone's talking about the same origins, same cultivars, the
Yeah.
same producers. And we didn't really feel like we were learning.
Yeah. And it was actually a little bit worrying to some point that we were doing some sort of our own exploration into some of the less known terroir regions in Japan to see if there's anything interesting over there. And for some places, it was quite disappointing, to be honest. It
Yeah.
was just seas and seas of Yabukita.
And maybe like 10% of that region grew Samidori.
Yeah,
And
but
that's it.
but, the farming technique is very homogeneous. Everything goes into the wholesalers or the local auctions, and it was just not interesting. We
Yeah.
were not learning anything new, and that was very worrying because, like, for any specialty movement to be able to flourish, you do need a soil of different people doing interesting different things in different regions, and that's like the foundation of anything that people can build their interest, can seek different directions depending on their preference or their curiosity. But that was not very confidence inspiring when we were doing that. So we got a little bit bored, a little bit disappointed, but we were too naive to make that assumption. This trip was very eye-opening.
Very eye-opening, and actually, to be honest, very humbling. We
Yeah.
almost titled this episode. We had a couple of humbling experiences just at how much we don't know, and how many more things there are to learn that are just incredibly interesting.
Mm.
So we wanted to share that. First, we're going to talk about our experience meeting Tsuji-san and everything that we learned at that experience, and then we're going to talk about an interesting experience that we had on our tour, a factory tour with Marukyu Koyamaen. And we ended up learning quite a few things, and we're actually pretty surprised at what we found. And a lot of their answers to our questions, it did not meet our expectations for what that was going to be like. And then last, we're going to talk about a fantastic experience at a wonderful tea house in Uji.
Baisa Nakamura.
Yes, this place is incredible. I used to say, Uji really doesn't have that many good places to drink tea. And this was hard reset. We not only got to learn a lot there, but what is going on there is absolutely insane from a cross-cultural influence on how other tea cultures are impacting the way Japanese tea producers or preparers or tea houses are approaching tea. And that was totally unexpected. So we're going to talk about our experience there. So to kick off with Tsuji-san, we get there and the very first thing that we start learning about is the soil types.
It's not just about the soil types, but like the mineral composition of different soils and how are they going to impact the flavor or the health of the tea bushes,
Yes.
which
So
was very interesting.
we're going to really get into the details here and just literally read through our notes and talk about what we've digested. So you can almost think of this as note sharing, but we left this feeling like, wow, there is so much to know about fertilizer. And then we were talking with Kun Pop afterward, and she was like, yeah, this is like 5% deep. And it was all stuff we had never heard before. Knowing that there's like 95% more of this knowledge underneath the iceberg
It's
is really exciting.
almost a little terrifying.
Yeah, very terrifying. It really makes you reset how much you think you know.
So what's the first thing we know
Well, so
or
there's
we learn?
broadly speaking, there's two soil types that matter within Japanese tea cultivation. There's clay-based and there's more like sandy soil. And clay-based is usually has worse drainage, but generally leads to more full-bodied tea. And easier to preserve a lot of the nutrients in the tea. So even whether or not it's clay-based or sand-based greatly impacts fertilization practices and how the method and how fast the different fertilizers can spread.
Yep. And ultimately, how suitable the soil is to farm matcha, because matcha is such a, you know, or I should say, conventional farming of matcha is such a fertilizer intense farming practice.
Yeah, so it's like a delivery mechanism.
Mm.
So like an equivalent in the human body might be something closer to like bioavailability. What is going on and what is the methods of how easy something is to digest and how it gets to you. And so that was super interesting. And when we were in Bangkok with a Koto Tea Space, we did a cupping, a pretty interesting cupping of 3 different Yabukitas. I think they were all from Shizuoka. And 2 of them were from clay soil types. Or excuse me, 2 of them were from sandy soil types. And 1 was from clay soil type. And they had relatively similar processing. And the goal of this cupping, the goal of this vertical tasting was to sort of understand the differences in body and texture that those had. And by far, the clay soil type had quite a bit more noticeable, rounded, fuller flavor than the sandy soil types, which were a little more, had some harder edges and kind of emptied out in the middle in terms of the drinking experience. And what was super interesting is that a lot of Tsuji-san's fields are actually sandy soil types, which really surprised Kumpap and Yusuke-san, who the first time they tasted their tea, they were like, oh, this must be clay soil types
Mm.
because of how uniquely rich Tsuji-san's matcha is, like famously rich. And he's won the national tea competition many, many times and all of these crazy awards. And it really kind of checks every box for what is considered high quality tea. And actually, something that's absolutely crazy to learn is that he is a first generation tencha farmer. So he's sixth generation tea farmer, but his father was making gokuro, mostly from Yabukita cultivar. So in a single generation, he switched it to all of these cultivars and to tencha and won the highest awards that exist in the category. So his ability to quote unquote talk to these tea plants, communicate with these tea plants, understand what they need and how flavor is driven, he is like a world-class master at this.
Yeah, well, like it's very interesting to see his approach in farming because in many ways he's like a scientist. He sends all of the clay soil samples to lab to test the exact mineral composition of these different soil types in his tea field, and he specifically optimized his fertilizer recipe for different soil types in his tea garden, and also in combination or in consideration with the specific cultivars that's growing on those soil types, and where like which position of those tea gardens is on the slope that are either sun-facing side or not sun-facing side, which has different connotation of sunlight exposure.
And
Um,
apparently, if you go really deep, the local Uji geography, like if you look over the course of millions of years of how the soil types ended up being what they are, it's actually like sometimes different fields can basically sit on a knife's edge where like half of the fields can be extremely iron rich, for example, and the other half is very not iron rich. So even within the fields that we were in Shirakawa Uji, there was quite a bit of variance within the visual field of looking around at just the soil types. The only way that he was able to know that was by sending all of that off to a lab, which is kind of crazy.
Yep. And there was a very short geology lecture that Yosuke-san given to us after the meeting with Tsuji-san is how the geological formation of Uji and also the whole Yamashiro region, as a whole, has a very complicated connotation of like ancient ocean and also like the formation of Biwa Lake and how a lot of these kind of marine creatures or shellfish precipitate their carcasses, which are very calcium rich, into the soil, and how the like ancient coastline has a connotation of the soil type that's right now, tea fields in the Yamashiro regions. That was very surprisingly, interesting segue of where can we extract information and also like where can we
Draw on other disciplines and
yeah, yeah,
knowledge bases.
knowledge bases to understand the current status of the tea in Uji.
A natural question to ask is like, why is iron content so important? I had no idea before this. It's pretty interesting. So one of the most important a very important mineral for to take into consideration when fertilizing is manganese. So the more manganese you add, of course, to a limit, it makes the tea plants really strong. It strengthens the tea plants. And the more iron you have, affects the absorption of manganese.
Mm.
So if you have really high iron content soil, you need to greatly increase the concentration of manganese to actually get the proper amount into the plants.
But if too much manganese, it's going to affect the taste of the tea.
Yeah.
Apparently, it makes the taste empty and less rich, according to Tsuji-san.
So it's actually a pretty delicate balancing act. It's not like you can just say, I'm putting this concentration of manganese and applying this much across all of the fields, right? Some of them might have way too much and some of them might not have enough if you don't actually know the iron content of your soil. So it's really an art and a science, and you don't want to overdo it because you're going to have tea that doesn't taste as good because too much manganese makes the tea too strong. And in doing that, I don't know what the mechanism is. He didn't explain it. Maybe, it spends too much energy building up other parts of the plant and not on the young tender leaves. I have no idea. And that would be like a complete random guess for the causal mechanism. But if you don't put enough, it's really bad for the plants as well.
And also fertilizer as a whole cannot be overdosed. And there's this like really great quote from Tsuji-san. And Ryan, you can translate.
So there was a very kind of yellowing color bud and cluster, like first and second leaf and bud. And we went in February, so like there's really not that many buds, which is a little interesting too. And he looked at it, and it looks a little emaciated and it's kind of weird pale yellow color.
Yeah, which is actually still quite confusing to me because that can also be a sign of the temperature is too low,
Mm.
like a cold damage to the tea leaf. But he was pointing at some leaf being yellow as cold damage, and that specific leaf as over fertilized. And
How he knows the difference is a great question.
yeah, no idea.
So even like understand, and this is all goes back to communicating with the tea plants and learning how to communicate with the tea plants. So he said when you look at this yellowing bud, it's having a direct connection with what's going on in the root system. And the quote that was translated for us, which I really love, is this tea is over fertilized, and the analogy was it was eating too much too fast and didn't digest.
Yeah, the
Um,
tea is obese.
and so you can absolutely over fertilize. And it turns out there's actually quite a bit of nuance to how you over fertilize what and when. And it's not just about putting things in the soil at a particular time. The rainfall greatly affects the way that fertilizer makes it into the plant, and the temperature. And the colder the temperature, the slower the intake. So the
Mm,
environmental factors actually play a pretty major role in the dosing. And they say that matcha. The more you talk to people who are experts in matcha cultivation, the more you realize that it's not actually very terroir expressive. The reason it tastes delicious is because of an enormous amount of human skill. And on this trip, we were saying, or the people in our group were saying, it's really like maybe 5% terroir expressive, but 95% it was someone's blood, sweat, and tears that made it taste that way.
mm.
And just reading the weather and reading the plant and understanding where it's at and what it needs and what the temperature is going to be, what the rainfall is going to be, is all the art of getting that fertilizer into the plant.
Yeah, there are some just crazy practices that Uji farmer has been doing in their unique understanding of farming practices. Suji-san is basically in his garden every single day doing the shading and harvest season to just check the condition of every single tea leaves. And we have learned that some farmers, when they were doing natural farming, so without pesticides, they will be just sitting in the tea garden catching insects. Like that's like next level commitment.
Yes, it is. Like, you really have to be in touch with what's going on in your tea garden. We also learned something very interesting just about cultivars in general. And apparently, Asahi cultivar is really just a pain.
Mm.
And it is super, super, super sensitive. So anytime you have delicious acai from someone, it was like massively more work to make that plant happy to produce great tea than other cultivars. It doesn't like it when it doesn't rain enough, so it's not very drought resistant. It can very easily be overshaded when you're doing shaded cultivation. It can very easily be over fertilized. Um, and it can also be very easily light damaged. And actually, one of the first times we were in Uji and visited a tea field within Uji, a lot of the Asahi cultivar plants did not look like they were doing well. And they put up these blue tarps, like these blue mesh tarps, not to shade the plant, but to protect it from the sun. And Asahi is one of those cultivars too that has pretty bad rooting problems. So whenever there's kind of two ways you can put tea in the ground and plant it into a garden. One is from seeds, where you take the seeds, and those seeds end up growing a taproot structure, and they can dig pretty deep. Or you can use grafts or clones, where you take a cutting, you take it off, it starts to grow roots, and you put it in the ground. So almost all Japanese tea cultivation now is all using these cultivars, and Asahi is one of these cultivars. They're all genetically identical, but they all have different levels of rooting problems compared to Zairai or seed propagated tea. So Asahi is famously terrible in terms of its rooting. And apparently, I think they were saying Uji Hikari has much better rooting performance. So we might start to see more and more Uji Hikari being planted over Asahi because it's much easier to grow and has relatively similar taste characteristics. And Uji Hikari is currently like winning all the competitions. So there's a pretty strong incentive, I think, for people to start to grow it.
And actually, because of the name, like farmers in Uji like to use Uji Hakari as their representation to submit to competitions,
Yeah.
which is very interesting to learn. So the other interesting thing about Asahi is that we learn how the leaf kind of gets heavy and then gets like this kind of like dropping down shape as it was reaching into maturity, or as a symbol of the tea is well fertilized
And very healthy.
and very healthy. It develops this very like interesting sheen under the light that was very unique compared to other cultivars.
And
So
it slightly drips down. Like it's not pointing up at a very high angle.
yeah.
It's a little more horizontal to the plant, but still slightly up. And he was saying that's a very good sign that that plant is doing well. That Asahi plant is doing very well. So, a pretty interesting visual indicator. Oh, he was also talking a lot about how he chooses different tea or different fields or different trees for a competition, for competition grade tea. And apparently, they don't really start tasting very good at their peak until they're about 10 years old. So, when you're going from cultivars, typically you can start harvesting after 3 to 5 years that they've been in the ground. But apparently, you have to wait another 5 years before it's really reached its peak. And what's really unique about Tsuji-san in Shirakawa is that he renews his trees every 20 years. And this is just unheard of from everything that we've heard from everyone.
That's which means the really like production years for a tea plant in Tsuji-san's farm is just 10 years.
Yeah,
That's uh
for competition at least.
yeah, for
Yeah.
competitions.
Or maybe even less for competition.
Yeah, that's like unheard of. Very extreme.
And so, I mean, this is true not only for matcha, but for other types of tea as well. Younger trees generally are considered more fragrant. So you'll hear a lot in like Chinese tea culture and appreciation circles that gushu or ancient tree or old trees are really really great, especially within the context of something Yunnan or other tea production areas. And this is true, but it's not always true across all types of tea. So Wuishan, for example, in Fujian, those producers generally also prefer very high fragrance tea
And also younger trees.
in younger trees.
Um,
So they do a lot of like ripping up very frequently to make sure that the age of the trees is always very young. And interestingly enough, there's two guards. A lot of people complain about this in the Chinese tea appreciation circles. The old guard, which, more of our friends associate with the old guard than the new guard, actually really like older trees and deep minerality because the older those trees get, the more mineral they are. And there's a perception of an overemphasis on high degrees of fragrance, and that everyone is just optimizing for more and more aromatically expressive tea. But you can also have older trees that just have this incredible minerality and a little bit deeper and less expressive. So there's just different preferences, at least in China.
and in Japan as well, actually, like not in matcha, but also but in other types of tea, like sencha and wakocha. Like people do prefer older trees for like these tea types.
You can, and even a little bit in matcha. There's some producers, I think, in Ujitawara that specifically talk about their 100-year-old trees that they still do shaded cultivation on, and they're all Zairai or seed propagated. We had one of those teas about a year ago. It is just incredibly fragrant and incredibly mineral. Has just this wonderful, it's a very intense tea, definitely has some bitterness to it, but it is just incredibly complex and deeply mineral and super interesting, like next level specialty.
Yeah.
But this is also one area that we have a problem with in all of Japanese tea appreciation at the competitions is that it has farmers optimizing for very specific types of profiles. Like a 100-year-old Zairai from Ujitawara that's organically grown, like almost by definition, could never place anywhere close to what they consider to be the top of the top of the top quality in the way that these teas get scored. But of course, it's all about control. And what's super interesting is just what you can do when you have deep knowledge of the plant, right? Like you're kind of driving a car and you're steering it towards certain flavor profile outcomes. And really, it's just all about perspective. And Tsuji-san's tea is just some of the most rich, incredibly complex tea that you can find in Japan, and is highly prized because of it all over the world.
Yeah, yeah.
And
It's really about like what you are optimizing for and what criterias you care about. Like it's the difference of building a luxury car versus a race car.
yeah,
Fujisan's tea is definitely a very fast race car.
it's a perfect analogy. We also learned a lot of other things about fertilizer and a new byproduct that goes into fertilizer. So some of the things that are commonly talked about in general, not just at Tsuji-san, but in other places, are things like sesame oil byproduct, like the leftovers when you press oil is a common fertilizer. Probably the most common one is rapeseed oil or canola oil. After you press those seeds, those like cakes, are frequently used and composted and basically turned into fertilizer. Different types of fish, rice and rice straw are commonly talked about.
We recently learned that people use meat.
And even meat. Yeah, meat and bones. That was pretty interesting. And one of the things that Suji-san was talking about was actually sugarcane byproduct.
Mm.
So in sugarcane processing, and apparently that byproduct is pretty easy to apply and it can become incredibly amino rich or amino acid rich after it's fermented. So a lot of these products, the rapeseed oil byproduct is not really the fertilizer. It's the result of the rapeseed oil byproduct getting broken down, fermented, composted, digested by local yeasts and fungi and bacteria. And that fermentation results in the actual fertilizer that the plant absorbs. And it turns out that the manufacturing of MSG is actually commonly uses sugarcane because it's very amino rich.
So we're basically applying MSG to the soil.
Yeah. So when you take this byproduct, it's super easy to absorb glutamic acid, which is,
Key
MSG,
ingredient
after
of
it gets
MSG.
fermented. But apparently, it is very, very, very easy to over fertilize. So it is like a precision instrument. You really have to know what you're doing and to understand where the plant is at, what the weather is going to be, how cold it's going to be, if it's going to rain, to determine how quickly the plant is going to absorb that. And this is just for one component of fertilizer.
Yeah.
Um,
And some of the other interesting ingredients that Suji-san use are fish from Brazil or Russia
yeah.
and soybeans from the States. It's a actually very globalized recipe.
Yeah, we
Uh,
asked him, how have the fertilizers changed over the decades? How has your
mm,
fertilizing practice changed? And he said, well, we just have much more options now.
yeah.
It's the globalization.
And for any new types of fish that he end up acquiring, he will actually eat it and taste it. And he said that one batch of fish from Russia was apparently too salty. So he didn't end up using them.
And apparently, fish in general as fertilizer has quite a few problems because it adds salt to the soil.
Yeah.
So you can very quickly deteriorate your soil quality if you're over aggressive in fertilizing with fish because it leaves residual salt behind. And we learned that the smaller fish, like anchovies, etc., and mackerel, yeah, are much more salty than the larger fish. So that's even a consideration of how much goes into. Suji-san's philosophy for fertilizing is he will not put anything in the ground that he doesn't eat himself, which I think it's a very nice,
Yeah. Guideline.
action standards. We also learned about more industrial types of fertilizer, which he does not use, but he was talking quite a bit, and we've heard of this being used in more mass plantation-based, higher volume places that use ammonium sulfate, which is incredibly fast-acting.
Yeah.
And the timing for using it apparently is super important.
And if you overdose it, it might burn the roots of the tea plants.
And you're really only supposed to put it on right when the shoots are coming out for it
Mm.
to take maximum effect.
It's basically an energy shot.
yeah, it's like a 5-hour energy for the
Yeah.
plants.
Oh, ammonium sulfate. Yum. That must smell
Mm.
good.
Yeah, it must smell. That smells so bad. Because you have both sulfur and ammonia.
And ammonia. Uh,
So another major thing We talked about we're sort of terroir, what they would talk about terroir, and the impact of sunlight and in orientation to where the tea plant is on a hill or in a valley. UV light is highest at sunset. So if a mountain is blocking the light at sunset, it's actually much better for matcha.
Mm,
So it's a pretty quantifiable, easy to reference thing for how matcha can be affected by the natural local landscape.
mm.
It's just the orientation of the sun at sunset
Yep.
and whether or not it's getting hit with that light.
And also, the best of the best composition is that the tea sits in some sort of a valley, so that the sun exposure is really minimized during every time of the year. That's actually what part of the reason why Tsuji-san specifically selects some of the tea plants, tea gardens in the region.
So there's a lot of secondary implications to fertilizer too. We were learning that a lot of the organic fertilizer is applied in the spring, and something like rapeseed oil cakes or canola oil byproduct cakes. You also have to be very sensitive to it because if you put too much, it generates a lot of gas during the fermentation. And it can really damage the root structure. So all of these things have a lot of secondary implications as well, where things like gas can. So the analogy that they use is kind of like having an Olympic athlete. He actually has a pretty interesting philosophy. He doesn't necessarily want very, very healthy tea plants, which is why he changes them every 20 years, which is an insane standard. He wants to push them right up into the edge so we can maximize fertilization, maximize umami, keep the plant as healthy as it can be, but as performant as it can be. And this is the true art of fertilization, is keeping it exactly up at that point. And that's really what it takes to win all of these competitions and to be considered some of the best matcha produced in the world. And learning all of this, like we know that fertilizer was important, learning this philosophy behind it, and we're only touching the tip of the iceberg, is just next level specialty. Like we just did not understand that. To me, it was like you have some secret recipe, like a secret like formula for Coca-Cola, or pick your random like secret recipe product, and you sprinkle it on the ground twice a year. So it's like raising like 10,000 children. And they all require different things from you at different times for
Mm.
different reasons.
Yeah, and we also learned that in the early days, Sushi-san only has Zairai in his field. And at the time, for him to be able to, understand the tea plants and control the fertilizers, he had to send um, multiple batches of his tea leaves into the lab to do multiple testings to understand, each xyri or xyri clusters, and apply fertilizers accordingly. So that was really crazy. And also, like, it's quite understandable why a lot of people, including Suji-san, switched to cultivars later on. There was this mysterious 30-year gap between cultivars start to becoming a thing versus everyone starting to convert into cultivar farming, which we still trying to understand or get the stories behind all of these conversions in the early days.
Yeah, it's very unclear how that entire industry switched from all seed propagated zyri. The implications of that is that the genetics of each plant is different. So cultivars are a form of asexual reproduction. You're producing clones. Zyri matcha basically is sexual reproduction. All of those, each individual plant is unique. So if you walk through a Zairai field, the leaf size, the leaf shape, how serrated the leaves are, how glossy they are, if they curl, if they don't curl, when they're ready to be harvested, when they put up new shoots, how deep the root structure goes, all of this is unique. And these plants look very different from from one another typically. And the annoying part is you can't just harvest all at once. Or if you do, half is quote unquote overripe, half is or a third is overripe, a third is underripe, and maybe a third is about perfect. So, back in the days, like 100 years ago when everything was Zyri, there are a lot of operational implications because you you have to really know every single tree in your entire field and
Mm.
determine when it is best to be picked.
And you need to have the labor power prearranged to pick those teas. So I bet that's also part of the reason why so many people end up converting into cultivars is like back in the days there were like the labor power involved in the tea industry in Uji was in the thousands. Now we only have a handful of matcha farmers left in the city of Uji, and which makes pre-arranging labor to pick tea much much harder. There was a big wave of cultivar conversion in the 70s, and that could be the reason or tipping point, um, like why so many people end up ripping their xyrite and converting into a cultivar.
And there's a lot of implications about that. Like you hear about other industries like coffee, where a lot of coffee varieties are very sensitive to certain viruses, such as rust, where there's sort of the systematic thing where all the best cultivars are suffering from all these diseases, which puts the future of sustainability of coffee into question. You hear similar stories about the Cavendish banana. Almost all the bananas that are cultivated in the world come from the Cavendish are Cavendish bananas, they're cultivars. And it makes everything incredibly fragile. And what's interesting about Uji is some of the greatest matcha cultivars ever to exist, such as Narino, such as Uji Hikari, such as Asahi, all came from Uji Zairai, which means they all came from these wild, or not wild, they all came from these sexually reproduced fields. And when you rip up the entire city of Uji Zairai, you're like taking the genetic diversity in the population from, let's say, like 100% to maybe less than 2. Like, I don't think anyone has any Zyri left. Like the mother trees, I think maybe they save, but we just lost a lot of genetic diversity.
Although we recently learned that there's still some xyrite left in the Okunoyama tea garden.
Yeah, we had the chance to meet Hori-san from Horishi Shimeyan and have about a 20-minute chat with him. And we were just endlessly talking about the the change from Zairai, how he discovered Narino, how they
Yeah,
discovered Okonoyama cultivar.
Hori-san actually brought up this old catalog from his father,
Notebook.
notebook, that documents the discovery of Narino and Okunoyama cultivars back in the days, and they were all like code numbers.
And we got to see it when it was numbers. And this table had like, I don't know, maybe 12 different columns.
They
Number
count like numbers of buds on each tree,
each
and
day.
each date and the weight of each bud,
The taste, the shape, the look,
the color.
the yield. Because when you're deciding what cultivar you want to pick, you really want to be sure it's good.
And it was a point system, so everything adds up to a certain score at the end. And then, Narino was one of the highest scored bush
And and
in the notebook, in the table.
and so is Okonoyama.
It was Okuno.
And there were a couple other rows in that table that also had a very high score.
Yeah,
I'm
yeah.
like, what are these?
Apparently, one of them is just a Yapukita. I
Oh,
wonder how good that Yapukita can be.
it's pretty interesting, but it's pretty sad because who knows, maybe when everyone, these fields have been cultivating, these irai fields have existed for hundreds of years. And, the plants that aren't suitable to survive in that climate die. And the ones that are good. And back in the day, the chashis, the tea blenders, were kind of stewards of the field. And they would go around to each tree and tell people when it was ready to be picked. So they really got to know each plant. And this is one of the origins of the Shiro and Mukashi naming conventions. A lot of tea is called like Hachu Mukashi or something something Mukashi or Yame no Shiro or Uji no Shiro or something no Shiro. And a lot of because the Zairai trees were so genetically diverse, some naturally produced lighter tea than others. And Shiro means white in Japanese. So apparently the chashis would go around and label some of the trees. These are shiro trees. They're like a light tree, and those were batched separately during tencha processing. So these chashis who got to know these fields that were cultivated for hundreds of years, from the Edo period all the way through today, or all the way through the 70s, represented an enormous amount of genetic richness, of genetic diversity, which was all lost. So we're slowly trying to uncover this the more we talk and meet and
Yeah.
get to know these farmers.
Yeah, that's One of the interesting answer to the question of why some tea is named as something something no shiro or something 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 no mukashi. There are many other theories, but it's all very interesting how a lot of these kind of norm that we take as granted today can be like not documented at all by
Right.
anyone, which is
In the words of David from Tezumi, no one really knows what's going on with this poetic naming convention. If you go to Uji today, they'll say, oh, no, Shiro or Shiro. Names, blends are for Usacha and Mukashi is for Koicha. And that might be true for like two vendors, but then it just doesn't hold true. So the whole thing is very confusing. But anyway, there's a lot of
yeah.
genetic diversity lost during this for sure. Maybe some of the research institute did preserve some of it. We hope. We don't know. We keep asking to go visit. They're very nice. They get back to us in like 24 hours every time I email them. One of these days, we will finally visit the center where we can ask to look through some of the records and maybe see if a lot of that was preserved at these research centers in Kyoto. But we did
That's
try asking Tsuji-san about this transition. Actually, I'm not sure. He didn't elaborate very much. But actually, that's when we learned that he was the first person to grow tencha, and they were just growing gokuro before in his father's
mm,
generation, mostly from Yabukita and I think some Zairai.
yeah. Well, like you mentioned, all these tea institutes exist in different prefectures in Japan, and I guess that's kind of lighthouses in the darkness, in the seed of cultivars. Like all of these institutes do preserve a lot of these dairais in different regions, and they are kind of like the genetic pool of the local tea landscapes. And as they keep propagating new types of cultivars in the future, we can experience some new possibilities, hopefully, beyond what we are used to drink today. And actually, they were part of the driving force and the pusher of farmers converting to cultivars in the early days as well. And a lot of these institutes offering free lectures to teach farmers how to farm specific cultivars, or they would let farmers to experience certain cultivars and talk to the farmers about their experience and learn from them and keep optimizing for the new cultivars. So there's a very interesting dynamics between the academia and the farmers and also the consumers or the chashis or the tea brands, which forms the whole very complex ecosystem of Japanese tea as a whole.
Which is always changing. Something else that we learned that was interesting when he was explaining that his father was mostly growing Gokuro is that actually, all the way through the Meiji period, I guess until his father's generation, one generation ago, is that Gokuro actually was sold for a higher price. It was an
Yeah.
economic incentive. And we've read this before. So, a lot of the matcha production, it was so insanely expensive in the Edo and towards the end of the Edo, which is around the mid 1800s, that a lot of farmers and a lot of tea companies, tea blenders, chashis, went out of business during the Meiji Restoration because it was largely sort of a patron of the arts model. If you can imagine, like in Venice, you had like the Medici family and they would sponsor all of these different artists. Imagine if the Medici family just fragmented and some of them got very poor. And all of these relationships with the funders, if you look at how the money flowed, there were a lot of downstream consequences of the Meiji Restoration after the fall of the shogunate, which really disrupted the tea industry. And we were reading some old books accounting this history, and not only a lot of them go out of business, but it shifted the industry. And apparently, Gokuro was much more profitable to farm than Uji, and that was the case until relatively recently, which is pretty interesting dynamic.
You
And
can
now everyone's switching to
Yeah.
tencha.
You can sort of still see that, mentality being or a legacy being part of the current day's Japanese perception of gyokuro. Like it's still considered as the pride of farmers in a very large way. Like farmers will talk very proudly about their gyokuro, but they quite infrequently brag about their tencha because a lot of them just go straight into large procurers and they end up in either large blend houses or auctions. So
Yep.
they remain basically nameless in the end product.
Yeah, they become a component and potentially a swappable component because the blends are never the same,
Yep.
interchangeable component. Something else we learned from Tsuji-san is some really good references for understanding taste. And this is something we talked about in our episode. It's all about the references, understanding the causal mechanisms for how and why certain flavors happened. So these are from my notes that were incredibly useful tips. So aftertaste is, he was telling us, is optimizing for good aftertaste is really autumn applied fertilizer. If you do not apply enough fertilizer in autumn, typically it means you'll have a worse aftertaste. And the first sip umami that you get is typically from spring fertilizer. So that lasting, wonderful taste is the art, 6 months before that tea is even harvested and applying fertilizer. And the initial sip is spring fertilizer.
And specifically, March and April are the most fertilizer absorption of tea plants. Those are the busiest days of any tea farmers in Uji, I guess.
And picking time apparently is really important for controlling for astringency. So if you miss the optimal picking window for any cultivar as it's being shaded, apparently if you get that wrong by a day or a few days, it has a pretty major implications on how astringent that tea is. So tea that was really picked really perfectly right on the right day really leads to fantastic tea quality. And this is something that a tea farmer in Gokusho, Furukawa Seicha, talked about on their Instagram post.
Mm.
Really great account to follow, by the way. They really have break it down, everything that's going on in the garden with as the seasons change.
A lot of great visual documentation.
Wonderful
Going.
visual documentation, including some of the fertilizer being broken down by microbes. And you can see rows and rows of tea, and it looks like there was snowfall, but it's not snowfall. It,
White mold.
it's a white mold as it's breaking down, and it's the local microbial flora that's breaking down and creating the fertilizer, which will then get later integrated into the plants.
Yeah. I guess that's part of the argument of trying to argue that, fertilizer is part of the terroir, really is created by the local environment by the end of the day.
Yeah. Actually, you can say that matcha is very terroir driven if you take into account like second order terroir, like not
Yeah.
what people primarily think of, but if you think of like the human skill
Yeah.
and culture of being able to have this knowledge to make the product and like the local microbial flora too.
And specific local ingredients for the fertilizers.
Arguably, it matters less and less now
Mm.
because it's such a global world. You can get access to almost any fertilizer anywhere, and these different products. Like they're using Brazilian fish.
Well, Tsuji-san has exceptionally globalized access into fertilizers, but some farmers in Shiragawa and also Gokasho that we have talked to, they only use local ingredients for their fertilizers.
So it's really all like mostly blood, sweat, and tears. But if you take into account like the human factor, you can say it's very terroir driven. But
Yeah.
arguably, this quality of tea can be grown anywhere. And even in the beginning, say the Kun Pop was very surprised that it was sandy soil because typically clay soils yield much higher quality, very full body tea, like she's experienced in other things. And that is just a testament to how like the incredible craftsmanship that Tsuji-san is doing to impart those flavors in spite of the soil quality in certain places. And it's about the decisions you make in the field to really maximize that potential.
So we only get to spend one single afternoon with Suji-san, and we already learned tons and tons of new information from him.
We
And
left there a little
a
overwhelmed.
little overwhelmed, to be honest. Well, hopefully we can keep meeting him in the future and learn more. But it's just you realize this is such a tip of a iceberg by the end of the day.
Like you hear about fertilizer being an art and like a skill and like all of this effort goes into it, but until you like really understand like this level of sophistication that
Mm.
goes on to creating such an amazing product, like you just don't fully appreciate it.
Mm.
And actually, this is something I wish that the whole specialty matcha industry could do better, is to describe like this level of insane effort that goes in to produce these flavors.
Yeah, I agree. And very unfortunately, this is one thing that a lot of the tea farmers do not want to be too transparent about is their fertilizer recipe. Suji-san was being very, honest and transparent to us. But, it's I wish this can be something that's, more widely available to consumers because like it's such a important factor or ingredient to the flavor profile of any matcha that's being farmed or conventional farming of
I'm
matcha.
actually a little skeptical of the claim that a lot of farmers are very cagey or secretive about their fertilizer recipe. I think that, maybe between each other they don't talk, but I think if you show enough interest and ask enough questions, like I think people will start talking and like having that be such an early conversation topic when we went on there and everyone was just asking more and more questions, we kind of unlocked that level showing that yes, we
Mm,
understand what you're talking about, we appreciate what you're talking about, and then we just kept being told more and more and more and more. Like it's
mm,
all about unlocking these levels. And I think the reason you wouldn't tell it to someone who's not at that level is the answer. There is no fertilizer recipe. There's like 10,000 flavor. There's 10,000 fertilizer recipes, and it just so happens to be based on like 10, maybe more than 10 different factors, dozens and dozens of factors from the rainfall to how much you did last year, to how salty that batch of fish is, to how cold it was, to the soil type, to how much iron was on it, like all of these. And this is supposedly is just the tip of the iceberg. It's really next
yep,
level specialty.
that's true. Way too much information.
There is no such thing as a fertilizer recipe. There is no one fertilizer recipe. And if there is just one, it's probably not very high quality tea because they're not taking any of this stuff into consideration. So it would be not super interesting or specialty.
Oh, no, I just want to learn about the fish that's indeed went from Russia or Brazil.
But it's endlessly fascinating. So, sort of on the opposite end of the spectrum, so we're talking about probably one of the most famous quote unquote single estates in all of Japan for producing matcha. We also visited the largest and one of the oldest blend houses in Japan, Marukyu Koyamaen. You can ask to get a factory tour. I think this is the fourth time I have applied on their website for a factory tour. And we've never gotten in. And this trip, they were like, "Oh, you can come after." Actually, it was rejected first, and then we got an email saying it was an error. We could come for the tour. So we got lucky. So have low expectations for getting in the first time you apply. But we got in and we finally got to see it. And I had heard good things about this tour, but it was very different from my expectations. It went way deeper than I thought. It is definitely an introductory tour, but we actually ended up learning way more than I thought. And they were able to answer the questions in greater depth. We didn't go there specifically to learn about matcha. I was really interested to learn more about Marukyu Koyama and all of the shortages, all the counterfeit, the sort of the most drama is associated with Marukyu. Like that's when we all realized there was a matcha shortage when they put up that famous Instagram post and blog post saying that they might run out of matcha before the end of the year. That's where it
Mm,
all started. So a couple of my notes from the tour is they spent a lot of time talking about traditional processing techniques for making tencha and specifically shiage processing. So taking a more crude version of tencha, like ara tencha, into millable tencha on an ishiyusu. And one of the things that they were talking about all this hand sorted stuff, and I was like, are any of your products still hand sorted? Do you use these techniques or are they only for competition tea that's not commercially available? I mean, it turns out one of their most famous products, one of the most famous blends in their standard portfolio is called Tenju, and it is hand sorted. So all of that chiage processing is hand done, and then it is hand sorted, leaf by leaf, by someone with chopsticks, which is kind of cool to know that they keep that alive
Current,
and that it's commercially available.
currently, during the harvest season or usually during summer, you can apply for internships to help hand sorting all these teas.
So if you're feeling very inspired to help make tenjo,
Ye-
apparently that opportunity is available. I don't know if you have to speak Japanese. So another thing that we've been talking a lot about on the podcast is this concept of the name of ujicha. And how ujicha really isn't a single origin product. It refers to a much broader thing. So if you look at the trademark definition, it can be from any tea from Mie, Shiga, or Nara, or Kyoto Prefecture. And we asked, like, is this just Uji-cha? Is it just Yameshiro region, which is the surrounding towns around Uji, like Wazuka, Ujitawara, Ide, Kyoto-nabe, Joyo, among others? And they said, no, no, it's from 4 prefectures. And they weren't even very shy about that. I was kind of shocked. Like, we source our tea from 4 prefectures. Like, that was it. Like, very
Mm,
factual. Something I wanted to also get into. So there's 10 different mainstream Marukyu blends. And I'm very curious about how and why they're 10. Why are there 10? Have there always been 10? Why did they add a new one? And they weren't able to really clarify like or justify the existence of all of these blends. There probably is some historical reason, but it's not publicly available.
Actually, they were telling us a few generations ago there were only was it 5 or 6 matcha in their portfolio, and two of them still exist in today's 10 product portfolio, which shares the oldest history. I think they are Yugen and Unkaku. But the portfolio just keeps rotating and expanding over the course of time. And a lot of the products are actually end up getting named by either a high priest in important temples or by, Iamotos of different tea ceremony schools.
Mhm.
So that was all very interesting. Like, very unique way of, I guess, doing guanxi management with some of these high status society as a tea house.
For anyone who is not for the uninitiated, how would you describe what guanxi management means? It's a Chinese word.
It is a Chinese word, but a lot of people probably have heard of it already. It's maintaining social connections, basically.
It's like networking, but way deeper and more genuine than the semantic connotations of English of quote unquote networking.
Yeah,
I
yeah,
heard
it's
this
more
back
subtle.
I think at the career fair or university, we were being given some generic advice to quote unquote water our network and like reach out to like 10% of our LinkedIn connections a month and just say hello, how you doing? How are your kids? Like very transactional, watering my network. Geez, Guanxi and Guanxi management is like that, but actually meaningful.
Yeah, yeah, and matcha and Chanoyu has been such a, I guess, a platform or a gateway for people to doing social network in Japan in the past few hundred years. It was really at some point the only safe space for samurais or warriors or these generals in Japan to talk business amongst each other because you have to give up your weapon before entering into the tea house. So that's a part of the, I guess, matcha as a telescope into the constellations of complexity of social elements of Japanese history.
Yeah. No, for sure. And it's interesting too. I was talking with an industry friend about the implications of adding a product to a portfolio, and they made a really interesting point. And it kind of half answers the question that I was trying to ask the tour guide is like, why did these products exist? When you only had 6 products and you had 7th product, like what is the reason beyond like maybe wanting to build connections of having someone name it? Why did you decide to make that new taste? And the 8th and the 9th and the 10th? Like,
Mm.
why weren't this other 6 good enough? Like, what was the impetus? Like, in the just because there's so much interesting, like, what I'll call historic specialty interest there, like understanding these poetic, and they like you don't know the cultivars, and back in the day, they weren't even cultivars; they were all zirai. The skill of blending is probably even more intense in the way that tea gets batched and harvested and then blended. That would be a really interesting thing to learn.
Yeah, actually, we did learn about something very interesting is that back in the days, there are these special events hosted by chashis to invite important clients, usually samurais or very important high status people, into their venue to select specific blends that they created as they're commissioned. So that was very interesting, and they have all these like very cute and well created illustrations of that specific scenes being had in the factory that we get to see.
Yeah, that was very cool.
Uh,
And on that tour, you get to see these historic scenes of things like that.
mhm,
So, actually, in some ways, it's very possible that each one of these products is actually a personalized blend to meet the preferences of a single individual. It's
mm,
certainly the case for the Iamoto endorsed products.
mm,
It is a personalized blend to meet the preferences of what is almost always one man. And this is actually where specialty matcha and our rant about like more like inclusive approaches and how all of the flavor profiles and quality decisions are for the understanding of what old Japanese men consider good among themselves and not paying enough attention to what's going on in the way matcha is being used in the rest of the world, which is actually what the last part of this episode is about.
Mm.
And our last experience, it really is the next level specialty. But before we get there, this matcha boom has a lot of interesting implications. And I asked them, like, are you ever going to release a single cultivar product? And they said, a lot of people ask us this.
And we do aware.
We are aware. This was a very surprising and not surprising sentence. And I sure that they would not tell us if they were planning on it. So they said, no, we don't have plans to do it. I don't know if I believe that answer 100%. If anyone could take specialty to the next level, it's a blend house like Marukyu Koyamaen. If you think about the amount of tencha that they probably have deep in their warehouse from 4 different prefectures, from probably dozens and dozens of farms, from many different cultivars, and perhaps from different vintages and cold storage, although they might have run through quite a bit of it during the matcha boom, where they didn't have enough aged material, because typically you want to age tencha for a little bit, and then you can blend it to get different profiles, because it tends to mellow out as it ages. But they could overnight flip a switch and let's release, like, I don't know, 1,000 cans of like 2015 Asahi from Joyo. They have the library and the depth and breadth to like make such a cool specialty that literally no farmer or company in the world has.
And the amount of leverage that they have to be able to extract information from the farmers, or like extract interesting information, useful information
Or
that they consider as important to the tea.
Or control the flavor profile outcome. Tell the farmers, I want it to taste more like this, or I want you to do this.
And just put those information on the label and educate consumers on how they understand tea based on their generations of knowledge in this industry. I think that will be something next level. And we actually see this kind of practice in some other regions in Japan. For example, sake. In a lot of these sake breweries in Japan, on the labels, you can learn specific koji that they use to inoculate the sake, specific rice cultivars, how polished the rice are, specific fermentation methods, specific environment, moisture in the local venue, temperature during the fermentation. You can learn everything about the sake. And that's one of the most traditional industry in Japan. And they're doing something, very transparent. And I think the tea industry can really learn something from them.
I don't think these blends are going away, but you have to ask yourself, in the next 20, 30, 40 years, we'll probably move from a world where there's a million like tea practitioners. I think there's about a million Urasenke tea practitioners in Japan at the moment. It's very likely, I don't know what the graph is, but if you look at the trajectories, that goes to 500,000. And that is an enormous difference. And then you project out even a few more decades. There is a structural decline in the tea ceremony traditional audience of people drinking tea. And if a sophisticated enough market merges abroad that really appreciates matcha as a specialty product, they have the most power, leverage, infrastructure, control, all of words like this, to unleash a level of specialty that we can only dream of, that is literally only accessible to the chashis at that single company.
Mm.
And the handful of other traditional blend houses. In hearing the sentence, a lot of people have been asking this, and we are aware, is interesting.
Encouraging. Yeah, based on our past interaction with a lot of these old legacy Japanese companies, that's almost a affirmation.
Marukyu also made a very clear point of mentioning that they are not afraid of innovation. Like, they use some very sophisticated tea processing equipment, including an electrostatic sorter. It was the first time I had actually heard of that, to help really clean up the tencha before it's milled, as well as like a really sophisticated lab, which really checks every single batch.
Mm.
The other thing that I was very surprised at, and that's much more specialty than I ever would have guessed, is that they indeed mill everything with a traditional stone ishiusu, including like the stuff that they put and mix with sugar in their latte mix. They have a little can of matcha that has like a spice, a perforated spice lid, so you can shake it. So it's like you can use matcha and like sprinkle it on some cupcakes without getting a sifter mess. Everything. I asked it like twice in different ways. Like, there's no ball mills.
Mm.
You use everything for ishiyusu, even like the latte mix.
Mm.
Yes, crazy.
That was crazy.
That is an insane standard.
The other interesting things is, in the beginning of the tour, they showed us a kind of like a video of, the history of tencha making, the history of Marukyu and all that. And there's a pretty like long section of how matcha can be used in other contexts, like ice cream, cakes, confectionaries.
Affogato, gelato was it was one of those things where you visit a 300-year-old institution that most people would describe as really the most traditional and the quote unquote the most authentic matcha you can get in Japan.
Uh,
And then all I'm thinking about are these like quote unquote Karens on Reddit talking about how we shouldn't be using ceremonial grade tea on
Latte.
culinary applications or lattes for that matter. Here is this 300-year-old company spending 5 minutes of this promotional video talking about all the different ways you can
Can
use
use
matcha.
matcha.
Very delicious as a topping on ice cream. Very delicious in cheesecake.
And in their souvenir store in the factory, you can even buy a bar of matcha soap.
And a lot of I mean, they do formulate for latte, and some of them say like it's suitable for latte, which is also kind of promising. But if you take a look at it, if you follow the standards of the Western internet about all the things you need to look for to find ceremonial grade matcha, first harvest, beautiful green color, it fits the bill. I think a lot of people who would blindly taste a lot of these the matcha that they're promoting to be used as a culinary ingredient would fit every box of a quote unquote ceremonial grade matcha. So we both actually started laughing. It was almost awkward. In the middle of
Yeah.
the video, our thoughts converged about just how ridiculous this would be if
Well,
you put this up to some like quote unquote Karen on the internet complaining
the
about the way people are using matcha.
the matcha they end up putting into their soap bar is probably better than the ceremonial grace that those Karens drink.
We hate this type of judgment and really take pleasure in these ironies.
Yes, indeed.
We don't rise above that.
Well, that was our experience at MK. Very, very inspiring too, in a different way.
Yeah, actually, we left there very energized and felt like we learned a lot. We really recommend, even if you know a ton about matcha, to go on this tour. It's not very expensive, and you actually get to taste some pretty cool matcha. There's a very beautiful little tea house inside, and the tour is really well done. And the tour guide, we asked her, like, how long have you been working here? She was like, 8 years. Like, she is not like some random summer intern that doesn't know very much.
Mm.
Like, the depth and breadth of knowledge about not only matcha, but about Marukyu as a company was really deep. That was very impressive. I was blown away actually. Had very low expectations there.
Well,
Because I kind of came in with what could be considered kind of obnoxiously specific questions that probably someone doing the tour guide wouldn't know, but it was not the case at all.
yeah, yeah. I bet they probably rotate. Like these are actual staff of the factory.
It was a very well done tour,
Mm.
and they were very, very nice and very just world class. Couldn't recommend it more.
And it was in English, so you can understand.
Yeah, very
We can
helpful too.
understand.
Very helpful too.
Yeah.
All right, Zongjun. Last but not least, what was our next level specialty matcha experience in Uji?
Well, it kind of happened over accident. We were spending time with one of our tea friends from Wazuka. And then by the end of the day, as we were driving back to Kyoto, he kind of proposed that we spend some time in his friend's tea house. So we went to this wonderful place that we had no expectation and idea at Nakamura.
We had heard about this place a little bit. And
Oh, we
we've been,
actually
we,
interviewed one of the staff who works at the venue.
yeah, Kungan was the first Thai Nihoncha instructor, first Thai national to ever achieve that rank, which is a really big deal. And, he mentioned he works at this place and they make fresh sencha. And we were like, from frozen wet leaf. And that's interesting. That's pretty weird. That's different.
Unconventional.
That's cool. Okay.
Yeah. But after we went there, it all starts to make sense. Like they are doing something else.
That was crazy. So they actually special ordered lab scale sencha processing equipment, and they can make 1 kilogram batches anytime. And the owner, Nakamura-san, has very good relationships with tea farmers in like Wazuka, I think some in
Kagoshima.
Kagoshima and Karishima specifically. And he goes there, he steams the tea, he freezes it at minus 60 degrees Celsius, packs it into blocks, keeps it in minus 60 degrees Celsius.
Minus 60 degrees Celsius.
That is almost the temperature of liquid nitrogen. I think liquid nitrogen is minus 68. Super cold. Thaws it out, takes the wet leaf, and then finishes the processing in 1 kilogram batches. And he's got tons of different cultivars, all sorts of interesting or sort of base material to work with. And the coolest thing is that he gets to make it like experiment with different parameters.
And what's even cooler is that all of the equipment and all of the activities is behind the counter bar.
Yep, everything is done in front of you.
You can see it, you can smell it, you can touch it.
People talk about multisensory experiences. This is smell, touch, taste, see, and hear all of this equipment in the back room. The sencha shaping machine going click, clack, click, clack, click, clack. You can hear the Ishiusu motors going in the background. You can smell the beautiful fragrance in the air. It's really, and then you obviously taste and smell the tea.
Wonderful sensory orchestra.
Yeah, it's unbelievable. And the coolest thing is, it's like the closest thing to a coffee roastery that we have ever seen, where there's so much transformative, value creating steps that are happening. There's a really interesting line. I think it was from Zach Mungan's book, Zach Mungan of Kettle, in his book. I think it's Stories of Japanese Tea. And he says, most tea farmers get to process tea 30 to 50 times in their life if they're only producing once a year. They got 30 to 50 shots to learn. And what's so interesting about this is that you get 30 to 50 shots probably every half year. If you can process in 1 kilogram batches and you have all this material, the amount that you can learn in the question of that learning, when you have all of this miniaturized equipment in front of you, you can optimize things faster, you can change things faster, you can understand cause and effect relationships faster about what's driving flavor, what's driving quality, run experiments and run grids, and that's definitely what's going on there.
Yeah.
And it's not only just happening for sencha, it's happening for matcha too. That was so cool. And they're doing a lot of tencha sourcing. And they're also starting to transform tencha, including to roast tencha.
Not as a hojicha, but like just the right amount of roastage to bring up some very interesting flavor.
High temperature, very short time, transforms some tea and imparts some crazy, delicious, nutty, chocolatey flavors that we all love from places like Yame.
And you can taste that in comparison. You can taste the unroasted version and the roast version, which is very, very interesting.
And we've had some very amazing, incredible experiences in Bangkok of having cold whisked matcha. So it's low temperature extraction, no water is used. People just take milk and mix it with matcha. And we've talked about this in the past, but you can close your eyes and you would literally think you're drinking hot chocolate. It tastes like chocolate. Your expectation, if you were blindfolded, would be that the product is brown and it ends up being this bright green color. And we finally kind of understanding where those flavors are coming from. And they can be totally introduced later by this type of roasting, because we tried the unroasted version and the roasted version. Exact same tencha. The only difference was that they ran it through this roaster, very high temperature, very short period of time. And wow, that sensory experience was replicated there. Like that is what specialty matcha should be. Like understanding that, holy crap, this tastes delicious. What can we do about it? Well, it turns out you can produce those flavors on your own.
And also just the fact that seeing this, quote unquote, nicknamed Thai style latte being done in center of Uji by local Japanese tea producers. That was super interesting. That was next level kind of culture exchange.
I never was expecting to see a Thai style cold whisk latte in Uji done by a Japanese farmer and or former farmer
Tea
and
producer.
tea producer. Oh, he's a tea producer now and
Yeah.
cafe owner, Nakamura-san, in Uji, downtown Uji Central, and loves it. And then he would add a little bit of sugar to it and say, "Whoa, like now it tastes like chocolate ice cream." Like
Mm.
just the level of cross cultural exchange and seeing a place like the Thai pre- appreciation, the Thai culture for appreciating matcha
Mm.
swing back to Japan
Yeah.
is insane.
Yep, yep. And just seeing how young Nakamura-san is and how open-minded he is like really, really hopeful. Like this is like really the future of the next, evolution of Uji matcha or Japanese matcha or matcha as a whole. That's really something that inspired a lot of hope and confidence.
That's something that every single person in the world can do that has the ability to mill is this transformative step to get this what they would call high hika, this roasted smell, which gives a lot of nuttiness in tea or a lot of chocolatiness in tea. So long as you have access to a roaster like this, where you do quick, high temperature, it preserves the color. It does make it slightly more yellow, but it's almost not even noticeable unless you make that comparison. You boom, that's where that flavor comes from.
Mm.
Has nothing to do with like other factors other than processing. And maybe the cultivar that you use, maybe some has certain taste characteristics different than others. But the fact that someone could do that, especially when those flavor profiles are really hard to find. Like my girlfriend, for example, loves this like yame matcha nuttiness, this intense like hazelnut and chocolate aromas and flavors that can appear in tea. They're really difficult to find sometimes.
Mm.
Even like the most famous producer is Hoshino Seicha. But like, where can you even buy Hoshino Seicha? Like everyone's sold out of their stuff. It's very hard to get your hands on,
Mm.
especially internationally. And if you do find it internationally, if you compare it to the Japan prices, you realize that there's like a 5x markup on the retail price. That it's available if you can buy it, if you can find it in Japan. So the fact that those flavors can be done retrospectively is just so exciting.
Yeah, very exciting. And some other interesting things that we end up trying is that a lot of the matcha that Nakamura-san makes are naturally farmed. So it's more like terroir and cultivar driven. And we got to try some of the very like esoteric cultivar made matcha. One of them is Asanoka. Actually, the father of that tea is a Chinese cultivar.
Even more cross cultural.
More cross culture, genetically speaking, which was very, very interesting. It has this like really interesting like fragrance, floral notes that you would only find in some of the more fragrant Chinese tea. In the coastal regions, and you kind of see that being expressed in the Japanese matcha was very, very interesting. And the other thing is just how open-minded Nakamura-san is. We were kind of like bashing on Chinese matcha, all this time, and we finally end up discovering some of the okay or better Chinese matcha. But we were kind of talking about that during a conversation with Nakamura-san, and he like turns back to us and said, "Okay, try this Chinese matcha, and it will change your mind." He was like actually like very open-minded about matcha being made elsewhere.
We were drinking a Chinese matcha in the center of Uji being served at that tea house. I don't think it's on the menu, but like he had it as a reference sample.
And as a recommendation to us, that he
This
thinks
might change your mind.
that
Yeah.
he thinks this is good and interesting. And what's more interesting is that after that matcha, he pulls out a Thai matcha from Qinglai,
Kungan brought it from Thailand. Yeah.
his colleague.
Yeah.
But they were also talking about this matcha being very interesting and had us try it.
It was a Jinshuan, which
It's
it's
a
a milk oolong, quote unquote milk oolong,
it's a Taiwanese
which was
cultivar.
developed by the Taiwanese Research Center, I think in the 1980s. Very common cultivar for high mountain oolong. And it
And
was Tana shelf shaded for 3 weeks, hand picked to Zumi in like, I think December or January, like is when it was like an appropriate temperature. It's a pseudo like autumn or winter harvest, which is like super weird. And because nutty matcha is very popular in Thailand, it was given a very high hika. So there's a lot of heat treatment. So there's
Mm.
kind of almost it smelled almost like dried peanut powder. It had sort of this earthy roasted notes to it. And we tasted it and wow, it was good. They were both good. I don't know how well it was milled. It was a little bit pasty, but honestly, the flavor was really stunning. And that was I guess it was the second Thai matcha that we had ever had. I've been very impressed.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
having those 2 samples and just like they're like other tea people. We call them like in Chinese tea culture, we call them cha-ren.
Or in
And
Japanese, charging.
Tajin, like, they're just generally interested in tea,
Yeah.
and, like, all of these judgments that get cast about fake matcha, real matcha, traditional, authentic, it's like, let's just let the product speak for itself, and it
Mm.
turns out, like, this tea is very delicious, and seeing other open we don't experience this attitude very much in Japan, um, so
That was very refreshing, to be honest.
very refreshing.
Yeah, yeah. It's honestly, it was a really Charino tea people meeting by the end of the day. We were sitting at the counter and we just had like this array of different trays and teacups laying on the table that we end up trying. That's made by different cultivar, made by different farming techniques, like made by different countries. And that was just like such a child moment because like it's about sharing, it's about curiosity. It's not about like judging or being, critical about specific definition that was like being, arbitrarily made by someone in the past. It was just genuinely curious and appreciating the diversity of different expression of communal sentences, by different people. And I think that's very important for the tea community as a whole, and for us being part of the tea community, is to like keep this curiosity and keep exploring. And this is also a really important part, I think, as the foundation of the creativity for a specialty product movement. Like a movement needs to be alive and moving forward. You really need to preserve this precious crivet that is getting constantly suffocated by all of these arbitrary rules and judgments passing by other people or passing by some authorities.
Absolutely.
Mm.
It's next level specialty,
Yeah, it
appreciating the
is.
product for what it is and seeing what can be achieved by the combination of creativity, curiosity about other tea and tea cultures, and agency. All of this lab scale equipment. He owns
Mm.
an Ishiyusu. He's able to roast his own tencha. He's able to go directly to the farmers. He's able to steam his own tea in a lot of cases. So that combination of resources, agency in the form of equipment, creativity, and curiosity is where specialty gets born, where
Mm.
all of these human stories get told.
Mm.
It's not a can of ceremonial grade. It's not even a can of organic okumidori, right? Like it's much, 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 much more specific around all of the intent and the effort that goes into creating these fantastic products that ultimately tell a very, very interesting human story and product story. Seeing that in action in the center of Uji is just so refreshing for us. It's humbling. It makes us feel optimistic. It's like next level specialty. People are moving the ball forward.
Yeah, yes, they are. Yes, they are. And seeing that being pushed and done by people within Japan is very, very confidence inspiring. Like the specialty is very much well alive here inside Japan, inside the birthplace of contemporary matcha. And I think that's really super important because as a lot of people talking about the whole specialty movement is as if, we are patronizing a culture that's not part of us. Like we are as a outsider
Mm,
trying to influence a country's history and culture. But seeing, they themselves being part of the player, I think is very, very important. And as what they say, the egg being from the outside is death, but the egg being break from the inside is new birth. And I think this is really the epitome of that analogy. We're seeing something being born within this thousand years old culture, and it's sparking something very, very delicious.
I can't think of a better place to end. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider sharing it with a friend, and we'll see you in the next one.
See you in the future.
See you.